Can a soul truly die before the body? Can a person cease to be, even while their heart still beats? These questions haunted Elias long before he understood their full weight, before the world around him crumbled into ash and silence. He was just 17, a boy truly, when the dark curtain descended upon his life, snatching away not just his home, but the very essence of who he thought he was. Before the darkness, there was light. Elias grew up in a small, quiet village, nestled by a winding river, a place where the scent of baking bread mingled with the scent of blooming lilacs in spring. His days were simple, filled with the warmth of family, the rhythm of ancient prayers, and the gentle drone of his father's voice as he taught Elias the sacred texts. Mendel, his father, was a scholar, a man whose eyes held the wisdom of generations, and whose hands, though calloused from years of tending their small garden, were always ready to guide Elias through the intricate pathways of faith. His mother, Leah, was the heart of their home, her laughter a melody, her touch a comfort. Younger twin sisters, Rivka and Sarah, brightened their small cottage with their endless energy and innocent questions. Life was predictable, safe, woven into the fabric of a community that cherished tradition and believed in the inherent goodness of the world. Elias envisioned a future not unlike his father's, a life of study, of quiet devotion, perhaps even teaching. He had dreams of a family of his own, a home filled with the same gentle love he had always known. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were distant rumblings, stories from faraway lands, dismissed by the elders as temporary madness, like a passing storm. But the storm did not pass. It gathered strength, darkening the horizon until its shadow fell upon their peaceful village. The first decrees were almost laughable in their absurdity. Yellow stars sewn onto coats, curfews, restrictions on commerce. How could such trivialities truly threaten their ancient way of life? Yet, with each passing week, the grip tightened. Neighbors who had shared meals for decades now looked away, their faces etched with fear. The river, once a source of calm, now seemed to murmur warnings. The ghetto was merely a prelude, a crude cage built from their own homes, sealed off with barbed wire. The world shrank to a few cramped streets, and the vibrant colors of life faded to shades of gray. Food became scarce, hope scarcer still. Elias watched as his mother's once bright eyes grew shadowed, as his father's shoulders, usually so straight, began to stoop. The twins, once so lively, huddled closer, their small faces mirroring the terror they sensed, but couldn't fully comprehend. Then came the definitive order: evacuation. They were to be resettled. The word hung in the air, a cruel lie. They were packed into cattle cars, standing shoulder to shoulder, so tightly pressed that breathing became a conscious effort, a fight for every tiny gulp of air. The stench of sweat, fear, and human waste filled the darkness. Rivka and Sarah, pressed between his mother and himself, whimpered. Elias tried to tell them stories, to sing soft lullabies, but his voice was hoarse, his throat dry with dread. His mother held his gaze, a silent plea in her eyes for him to be strong, for them all. He saw her lips move, whispering something he couldn't hear over the groaning of the train, the muffled cries of the desperate. "Remember," he thought she said. "Remember us." NNTHE train journey was an eternity of darkness, hunger, and thirst. The human spirit, usually so resilient, began to fray. Dignity vanished. The sick lay where they fell. The dead remained standing, propped up by the living. Elias clung to his father, their hands locked in a desperate grip. His mother, with the twins clutched to her, was on the other side of the crowded wagon. When the train finally lurched to a halt, a brutal light pierced the darkness, revealing a landscape unlike anything Elias had ever seen. Watchtowers loomed against a bruised sky, barbed wire stretched endlessly, and the air tasted of something acrid, metallic like burnt bone. "Out! Out! Schnell!" Brutal shouts, the barking of dogs, the crack of whips. People stumbled out, blinded by the sudden light, disoriented, terrified. In the chaos, Elias lost sight of his mother and sisters. He screamed their names, pushing against the surging crowd, but they were gone, swallowed by the swirling mass of humanity. His father gripped his arm, his face pale, his eyes wide with a horror that eclipsed even Elias's own. "Stay close, Elias! Stay close!" Then came the selections. A figure in a uniform, his face a mask of indifference, waved his hand left or right, deciding destinies with casual cruelty. Women, children, the elderly, the sick, all waved to the left, the able-bodied men to the right. Elias instinctively pulled his father towards the right, praying he looked strong enough. His father, though thin, was still upright. The man glanced at them, his eyes lingering on his father's worn face, then waved them both to the right. A fleeting, nauseating relief washed over Elias, immediately followed by the crushing realization his mother and sisters had gone the other way. He knew with a certainty that froze his blood what the left meant. The smoke curling from the distant chimneys, thick and greasy, suddenly took on a grotesque meaning. They were stripped, shaved, disinfected. Elias stared at his reflection in a shard of glass. A stranger stared back, hairless, gaunt, his eyes hollowed out. His new name was a number, tattooed onto his forearm, A7713. They were no longer Elias and Mendel, father and son. They were units, cogs in a monstrous machine. The world had turned upside down. The heavens had fallen silent. The only sound was the constant, low hum of the crematoria, a grotesque lullaby of death. Life in the camp was a relentless assault on the senses, a systematic dismantling of the soul. Each day was a brutal cycle of starvation, exhaustion, and the omnipresent threat of arbitrary violence. The meager ration of watery soup and stale bread was barely enough to sustain life, let alone hope. Elias's body, once lean and agile, began to waste away, his bones pushing against his skin. Every movement was an effort, every breath a shallow sigh. The cold was a constant companion, gnawing at their bones, and the thin striped uniform offered no real protection. And work was endless, hauling stones, digging trenches, pushing heavy carts, all under the constant, screaming supervision of capos, prisoners appointed as overseers, often more brutal than the SS themselves, eager to prove their loyalty and secure a few extra crumbs of survival. Beatings were common, swift, and often without reason. A misplaced glance, a moment of hesitation, a perceived slowness. Any infraction could invite a savage blow from a rifle butt or a fist. The strongest survived, not always the kindest. Humanity curdled in the face of such absolute depravity. Elias witnessed horrors that would forever brand his memory. He saw men hanged for stealing a crust of bread, their bodies swaying in the morning breeze as a chilling warning. He saw children, no older than his sisters, dragged away, their cries echoing in the night. He saw men fight savagely over a discarded potato peel, their desperation stripping them bare of all pretense of civilization. The silence of God became deafening. Elias, once so devout, found his faith eroding with each new atrocity. How could a benevolent God allow this? Where was his mercy? Where was his justice? The questions became a bitter refrain in his mind, shouted into the void, answered only by the omnipresent smoke. He saw men pray, then saw those same men succumb to the same fate, their prayers unanswered. Slowly, insidiously, Elias's own prayers faltered, then ceased altogether. The words tasted like Ash in H.I.'s father, Mendel, became the anchor in this churning sea of despair. They clung to each other, two fragile souls in a maelstrom. In the initial days, Mendel, though weakened, still tried to offer words of comfort, drawing upon his vast knowledge of religious texts, whispering passages about endurance and faith. But the camp's relentless grind wore him down. His steps grew slower, his eyes dimmer. His once strong hands trembled. Elias, who had always looked up to his father as an unshakable pillar, now watched him shrink, day by day. Their roles began to reverse. Elias, younger and with a body still able to absorb more abuse, became the protector. He shared his meager rations, sometimes even managing to sneak an extra scrap for his father from a careless capo, or during the chaos of food distribution. He helped his father stand during roll calls, shielding him from the capo's watchful eyes, whispering encouragement when Mendel's spirit threatened to break. The moral compromises began subtly, then grew more pervasive. The camp fostered a brutal individualism, every man for himself. To survive, you had to be alert, cunning, sometimes ruthless. Elias saw men abandon their friends, their brothers, even their own fathers, in the desperate scramble for survival. There were times, moments of profound weakness, when a dark thought would flicker through Elias's mind. If only father wasn't here. If only he didn't have to carry this extra burden. The thought filled him with immediate, searing guilt, a betrayal worse than any physical pain. Yet the thoughts persisted, a testament to the camp's insidious power to corrupt even the most loving bonds. He would then force himself to push them away, to tend to his father, to repeat silently, like a forgotten prayer, "He is all I have left. I must not lose him." NBUT, even in this abyss, tiny sparks of humanity occasionally flared. A fellow prisoner, an older man named Isaac who worked in the same labor detail, once shared a small, smuggled piece of potato with Elias, his eyes conveying a silent understanding that transcended words. A capo, surprisingly on a freezing morning, looked away when Mendel stumbled, allowing Elias to help him up without a blow. These moments were rare, fleeting, almost swallowed by the surrounding darkness, but they were real. They were proof that somewhere, deep beneath the layers of suffering, the capacity for kindness still existed, even if only in fragile, fragmented forms. They reminded Elias that he wasn't entirely alone, that not everyone had completely lost their soul. Then came the evacuation order. The distant rumble of Allied artillery was a double-edged sword, a harbinger of potential freedom, but also a signal for the SS to liquidate the camps, to erase all traces of their monstrous crimes. They were forced onto a death march, thousands of skeletal figures stumbling through the bitter snow. Elias pulled his father along, Mendel's breath coming in ragged gasps. The weak fell, and the shots rang out quickly behind them. There was no stopping, no resting. The cold bit into their flesh, the hunger gnawed at their insides, and exhaustion dragged at their limbs like lead weights. Mendel's condition deteriorated rapidly. His eyes, once full of light, were now clouded, unfocused. He mumbled incoherently, sometimes calling out for Leah, sometimes for Elias's long-dead grandfather. Elias propped him up, half carrying him, his own body screaming in protest. He slapped his father's face, whispered desperate pleas, anything to keep him moving, to keep him from falling behind. He watched as others collapsed, swallowed by the snow, their final screams silenced by a crack of a rifle. He couldn't let his father be one of them. They arrived at a transit camp, a temporary holding pen, even more crowded and desolate than the main camp. Mendel was barely conscious now, his breathing shallow. Elias watched over him, fighting off others who tried to push him away, to take his father's last scraps of blanket. In the pre-dawn hours, just before the next forced march, Elias felt his father's hand go limp in his own. He pressed his ear to Mendel's chest, listening for a heartbeat, but there was only silence. He whispered his father's name, shook him gently, then harder. Nothing, and a wave of conflicting emotions crashed over Elias. Grief, profound and agonizing, for the loss of the last piece of his family, the last tie to his past. But beneath it, a dark, shameful current of relief. The burden was gone. He was free to survive for himself. The thought was monstrous, a testament to how deeply the camp had twisted his soul. He stared at his father's lifeless face, the last flicker of his own humanity seemingly extinguished. He didn't cry. He couldn't. His eyes were dry. His heart a hollow drum. He was alone. Truly alone. And in that moment he felt nothing but a vast, terrifying emptiness. The man he had been, the boy filled with faith and love, had died on that cold, desolate ground. The day of liberation came not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the air. The screams of the SS guards had ceased. The barking of dogs was gone. A different kind of uniform appeared at the gate, speaking a different language, their faces etched with shock and pity. Elias, huddled in a corner of the barracks, saw them, but felt nothing. No joy, no relief, only a profound, echoing emptiness. He was a shell, animated by some unseen mechanical force. His body was starving, ravaged by disease, but it was his soul that was truly gone. Anhe was carried to a makeshift hospital, a field tent filled with other skeletal figures, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and sickness. The nurses and doctors, with their kind, bewildered eyes, tried to feed him, to speak to him, but the words were meaningless sounds. He ate, not because he was hungry, but because his body demanded it. He lay in a bed, not because he was tired, but because he had no other place to go. Days blurred into weeks. His physical wounds slowly began to heal, the gauntness gradually giving way to a semblance of flesh. But the wounds within, the ones that festered unseen, remained raw and untouched. He had nightmares, endless loops of the train, the selections, the smoke, his father's dying breath. He would wake up screaming, or more often, wake up silent, shrouded in a cold sweat, unable to distinguish dream from memory. NNTHE initial period post-liberation was a void. He had survived, yes, but what was left to survive for? His family was gone. His home was gone. His faith was shattered. He had no future, only an unbearable past. He saw other survivors beginning to talk, to share their stories, to search for relatives. Elias could not. The words stuck in his throat. What was there to say? How could he describe the indescribable? He was a ghost haunting his own living body. NNTHE long road to healing began almost by accident, with small, hesitant steps. A young nurse, her name was Anya, often sat by his bedside, not speaking, just being present. She would hum soft melodies, or simply hold his hand, her touch surprisingly warm and steady. Elias, who had flinched from touch for so long, found himself not pulling away. One afternoon, she brought him a small, crudely carved wooden bird. "For you," she whispered, her eyes gentle. Elias looked at the bird, then at her. It was the first time he had truly seen a human face since the camps, a face without hatred, without fear. A tiny, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the wall around his heart. Slowly, painfully, he began to reconnect with humanity. He listened to other survivors in the hospital, fragments of their stories resonating with his own. He heard stories of impossible courage, of small acts of defiance, of enduring love. He saw tears, and for the first time since his father's death, felt a faint prickling behind his own eyes. The rigid shell he had built around himself began to soften, centimeter by agonizing centimeter. Rediscovering his identity was harder. For so long, he had been A7713, a number, a disposable unit. He struggled to remember his own name, the names of his sisters, the specific details of his village. It was as if his mind, to protect itself, had erased the very memories that defined him. But Anya, and later a kindly social worker named Dr. Goldstein, encouraged him. They gave him a notebook and a pencil. "Write anything that comes to mind," Dr. Goldstein suggested. "A word, a feeling, a dream. Just write." Elias began with hesitant, shaky letters. A7713. Then, after many blank pages, Mendel. Then, Leah. Then, Rivka. Sarah. The names were like stepping stones across a vast, dark river. He remembered the smell of his mother's bread, the feel of his father's hand, the twins' bright laughter. He was Elias again, a boy from a village, a son, a brother. The scars were there, deep and unyielding, but the face looking back from the water's surface was his own. Then came the crushing weight of the burden of witness. As his mind cleared, the memories returned with a vengeance, not as nightmares, but as stark, undeniable truths. He had seen it all, he had lived through it, and he had survived. What was he to do with this terrible knowledge? How could he bear it alone? How could he speak of the unspeakable to a world that could barely comprehend it? The task felt monumental, impossible. There were days when he wished he had not survived, when the weight of remembrance was too heavy to bear. An NBUT, a new purpose, a glimmer of hope, slowly began to emerge from the wreckage of his soul. It wasn't a return to the unquestioning faith of his youth. That faith, in many ways, was gone, replaced by a profound understanding of human cruelty and indifference. His moral awakening wasn't about finding God again, but about finding a new kind of faith. Faith in humanity's capacity to learn, to grow, to prevent such darkness from consuming the world again. He realized that his survival carried a profound responsibility. To remember, to speak, to ensure that the voices silenced in the ash would not be forgotten. He became a living testament, a whisper against the roaring winds of forgetting. His suffering, once a meaningless agony, began to transform into a mission. He would not just survive, he would bear witness. NNHI's first steps back into the world were tentative. He found a small community of other survivors, a fragile network of shared pain and nascent hope. They understood each other in a way no one else could. They shared silent glances that spoke volumes. Elias started to speak, first in hushed tones with fellow survivors, then to Dr. Goldstein, slowly articulating the fragments of his story. The words were difficult, each one torn from a deep, painful place, but with each telling, the burden seemed to lighten, if only infinitesimally. He wasn't free from the past, not truly, but he was no longer enslaved by it. He was learning to carry it, to live with it, to transform it. Years passed. Elias, no longer a boy, but a man etched with the lines of unspeakable experience, found his voice. He traveled, spoke in schools, at remembrance ceremonies, to anyone who would listen. His words were simple, devoid of bitterness, but imbued with a profound gravity. He spoke not just of the horrors, but of the choices, the moments of moral compromise, the small acts of resistance, the desperate clinging to a loved one, the agonizing relief of loss. He spoke of his father, of his mother and sisters, ensuring their names, though vanished from the world, lived on in his memory and in the hearts of those who listened. NNHE often concluded his talks with the same thought, refined over decades of reflection. The ashes of the past do not just lie silently. They whisper, they scream, they echo through time. My story, our stories, are not just about what was lost. They are about what can still be saved. They are a call to conscience, a reminder that indifference is not neutral, but an accomplice. Remember, listen, and act. NNTHE scars remained, deep and unyielding, visible only to him. But now they were not symbols of brokenness, but of endurance. Elias had found a purpose beyond survival. He was an echo, a voice from the ash, ensuring that the world would never truly forget. His emotional payoff wasn't joy in the traditional sense, but a profound peace found in the act of remembrance, in the knowledge that his shattered past could illuminate a path forward for others. He had walked through hell, lost everything, and yet he emerged with a truth that transcended his own suffering. The human spirit, even when brutalized, can find a way to rebuild, to witness, and to remind the world of its profound capacity for both darkness and light. This story, like countless others, is a testament to the human spirit's resilience and a stark reminder of the darkest chapters in history. We must never forget. Join us at Engaging Voices as we continue to share stories that provoke thought, inspire action, and ensure that the lessons of the past guide our future.